Okay, so second class on the discarded image, and I didn't make a lot of headway last time getting into the medieval situation as Lewis described it, and a little bit of his reservations, though not as much even of that as I would have liked to. Today I want to move on rather more swiftly and try and get all the way to heaven with you. So there you go. Ambitious project. So through the classical period selected materials and also the seminal period, and then try to reach chapter 5 of the heavens. We'll see whether I actually get there. But that is the plan for the class, and I am going to, in order to do that selectively, take little sections out of the book to emphasize for you. With respect to the reservations, I think I did need to say two things, and he mentions them on pages 14 and 15. Which I thought was useful. And this was with respect to the model. Remember, we're talking about the discarded image as an introduction to the medieval and Renaissance literature, but what he's talking about is an image, what we often call a worldview, but it's more of an artistic representation of it. It's a picture that one has in one's mind's eye when one looks around. What do you think about? How do things relate to each other? Because implicitly people do that. To make sense of things, they have a sort of image in their mind that makes sense of things. And that's the case here. And this is what he's suggesting, that the medieval mind, the Renaissance mind, and I guess we'll say the Christian mind, but even the non-Christian mind, they'll have in their mental understanding, an interpretive grid, certain assumptions about the reality that they see around them. And one of them is, what's the reality of the reality I see around them? Do I actually see the reality, or do I, as the Hindus say, see Maya, an illusion? Because that's one of the questions, and it's certainly one of the philosophical questions, and the skeptics are intensely suspicious of their senses, and we're not. We think our senses deliver factual information. He's going to some degree, and this is why this is such a useful study, is going to lead us to question what we don't question, namely, among other things, the nature of nature. And I'll get through that here. But also whether what we call nature is in fact equivalent to science, and he's going to thereby debunk scientism and the validity of scientism, which is based on what science delivers to us, which is nothing other than what our senses deliver to us, which from the classical perspective is a nonsensical perspective, because we can't trust our eyes or our five senses to deliver to us what is ultimately real. And there's a variety of reasons for that. But here in 14, he says, the business of the natural philosopher is to construct theories which will, quote, save appearances. Now, this expression comes to us in chapter 8 of Paradise Lost. I'll get to that next semester when I look at Milton with you. But he says that we've probably misunderstood what Milton means by saving the appearances. He's translating a Greek phrase, sodzane ta phenomena, used by Simplicius in his commentary on the Aristotelian De Caelo of the heavens. And a scientific theory must save or preserve the appearances, that is, the phenomena, it deals with in a sense of getting them all in, doing justice to all of the things that are evident to us. And that will include things that are not visible, things like dreams that come to us. We're going to have to account for those. The idea that there are gods which we don't see, we're going to have to account for those things. We're going to have to give account for a sense that things seem to be fated or even ordered, that there's a pattern and order to existence. We have to account for those things. We don't just discount them because we can't see those things. Well, we can't see time, and we also can't see number. We can't see number. Numbers are not a visible entity, and yet they're essential for scientific understanding. So are the laws of logic. without which thinking is not possible, says Aristotle. And yet, in our age, we discount the laws of logic, it seems, and appeal to science. For them, this is an absurdity. So we have to account for that in the model of, or the image we have in our mind's eye of things. We have to account for all those things. So that's the one thing, we have to save the appearances. And the second thing that he says we need to have from a theory is simplicity, what we call Occam's razor. So the most simple explanation for all of the various things that we need to take account of, those are going to be contained in the medieval model. But finally, he says, we need to bear in mind that the medievals were not as credulous as we are and think that the model is the reality. It's just a hypothesis, just like a scientific theory, which we now call science. In our delusional misunderstanding of the scientific method, we think that the theory is the reality. I will come to that in a second, because he makes a very interesting comment about that as well, that we have a new theory of theories. But for the medieval and ancient philosophers, they realize they're speculating. They're approximating. This is the most probable explanation for things. In many ways, it's a very scientific postulate. And they appeal to the appearances. How do we save all the appearances? As I say, how do we save our understanding that mathematics, or number rather, is a way of understanding the subject that they will, the group of subjects that they will call the quadrivium? How do we account for number, which underlies not only arithmetic but also geometry and music and astronomy, those four liberal arts that slot under the quadrivium, four ways of knowing, all of which have number in mind, number which we cannot see. But we have to account for that. Otherwise, knowledge is not possible. Let's say, to me, the medieval model has more to recommend it in some ways than the contemporary model, which is very disjointed. And again, if it's empiricist, radically empiricist, then it denies the reality of number. Or we'll say that it's a social construct, and so we can say 2 + 2 = 5 or some idiocy, which is not the way things work. It literally is not the way things work. It's not a social construct to say 2 + 2 = 4. Try building a bridge where numbers and equations don't work, where logic does not apply. That is a non-reality version of reality. That is a social construct, and clearly a fallacious one. So the model is provisional, he says on 16. Recognize this fact. The model is provisional. And what we should like to know is how far down the intellectual scale this cautious view extended. In our age, I think, Lewis says, it would be fair to say that the ease with which a scientific theory assumes the dignity and rigidity of fact varies inversely with the individual scientific education. Now, I've observed this. The more credible the scientist, the more lightly he holds to the prevailing theory. The more lightly, because they're aware that, and this is part of the whole scientific method, we are presenting a hypothesis, and we're going to see that the hypothesis might need to be altered and tweaked, maybe altogether overturned, perhaps, based on the findings that we come up with. Whereas textbook science, which is taught to schools, presents science as a factual basis for understanding things, and yet you can't question the science. Right? You can't question the science, which is an absurdity. Because science is knowledge. And knowledge, of course, needs to be questioned. And it doesn't matter what the experts say. If the experts are all wrong, save one, the one who's right. It's not about a matter of democratic numbers. Anyway, so he observes this, though, that the more educated they are, the more they're willing to concede that this is a provisional model. It's a model. And he says, in discussion with wholly uneducated audiences, I have sometimes found matter which real scientists would regard as highly speculative, more firmly believed than many things within our real knowledge. So, and now he gives an example which he's probably got from Chesterton. But the idea that popular idea of the imago of the caveman ranked as a hard fact, and the life of Caesar or Napoleon or Jesus as doubtful rumor. Like, as if cavemen, there's proof for this. There's no proof for it. It's a supposition on a basis of a certain view of language evolving out of grunts and cries. And so we have a type of humanoid that is pre-rational, that fits in with a Darwinian view of evolution, which again they say is science, even though Darwinian evolution is now debunked by every credible scientist. But it's still textbook science. Anyway, yes?
I don't want to get you too off track.
No, because I get myself off track.
But when you were talking about how, and Lewis was as well, how the medievalists didn't necessarily think that the model was the absolute truth, and they were open perhaps to new ways of thinking about it, why then did a sun-centric model and the discovery of how that worked?
I'm gonna get to that. So why did the heliocentric view overturn the geocentric view?
Like, why did it cause such a problem
If it was just a theory, it would not have.
Yeah.
It would not have, is the answer. It would not. The theory itself, the supposition, would not have overturned the geocentric model because it already existed. Actually, the idea that that the sun was at the center of the solar system existed in the ancient world. They just, in the end, moved towards the Aristotelian. They thought Aristotle was correct. Aristotle became the normative, and the church pegged its teaching to this and constructed a whole model in accordance with it. And you could entertain it as a theory, but the point is that Galileo, and Lewis will make this point, and I've made it in my own scholarship, the Galileo presented it as a fact. Said, here's my telescope, I can see it, observe for yourself. This cannot be doubted. You can verify what's going on in the heavens is not something that we can dispute over. There's movement out there in ways that, first of all, we can see 4 planets revolving around Jupiter, not around us. So there's a difference there. And then we have nova in the skies and so forth. That doesn't fit into the old model, but we can see it with our own eyes. So the facts, a fact is something that I make, by the way, from facere, the verb, or the Latin verb. I make for myself. So it encourages the autonomous methodology of the sciences as well. You can use an instrument to verify something that you could not see with the naked eye. And so then there's an increasing dependence on technology in the Western world as a means of of saving the appearances. But now it goes beyond a theory and it's taken to be, this is a fact. And we appeal to facts when we speak of science. And even our theory of theories is that our theories become more and more rigid and less actually willing to question reality, that characteristic of our day. Again, COVID shut the whole world around by appeal to the sciences. Well, the science tells us. Well, the science doesn't tell us a darn thing. A few scientists do. Right? Computer modeling suggests this. Well, the computer models were all projections based on certain suppositions about what was going to happen, which is fine and good, but the reality of it is that it never ended up anything like the projections were. But science told, and therefore the reaction was extreme, in part because they had no suspicion of what science actually does, or how credible scientists could be, particularly about something like a flu virus. Right? Nobody's that certain, because every year there's a new variant of a flu virus. How dangerous is it going to be, and to whom? Like that, they have to project, because again, they're approximating it. Anyway, so he talks about this. This is very interesting, and then he goes on to say the mass media, which have in our time created a popular scientism, a caricature of the true sciences, did not then exist. There's an interesting point as well. So 2 things, the technology and also the mass means of presenting it to the population, which he also speaks of in The Abolition of Man. And talking about the wireless and the regular communication and the news taken as facts, not reporting of something that they see but might not be as they see it. So those are things of the modern world which we think make us less credible, and Lewis suggests makes us more credulous. We're actually more gullible than those of the past, in part because we believe what science teaches us, and science has improved the world, they'll say, which is at least debatable. Certainly changed it. So I'll skip over the reservations. Let me move on to the classical period selected materials. And this is page 22. So there we go. And we will begin with the Somnium Scipionis, the dream of Scipio. Interesting, and again, I assume that people have not read Plato and not read Cicero, and so I'm going to direct you to significance here, because you will notice in many works of literature, medieval, Renaissance, and otherwise, it will often end with dreams or even with visions of a certain type. So Dante, for instance, in the Commedia, well, the last word of each of the three canticles is the word stars. And remember, he begins his whole Commedia in the Inferno in the middle of all our life's journey. I found myself in a dark wood. And what's unclear at that point at the outset is that the 3-day voyage that he's about to undertake is a dream, and it takes place over Good Friday, Saturday, and Easter Sunday. It's a 3-day journey through the 3 regions that he acknowledges, that of the earth and of purgatory and of heaven. But each of the 3 concludes with a star. Well, the star is a part of a dream vision. So it should have tipped us off. And if we're not tipped off, the conclusion of the Paradiso makes it clear that he's awoken from the dream. So the whole thing's a dream sequence. And he's taken this from other works, and the other works chiefly that he'll be concerned with are Plato's Republic and Cicero's De Officiis. So let me read this here. So Plato's Republic, as everyone knows, well, everyone who's read it, and again, we don't read it, but if we did, the conclusion of Plato's Republic ends with an account of the afterlife, put into the words of one Er, E-R, the Armenian, who had returned from the dead. Isn't that interesting? So Plato's Republic, which is a retort to Homer, also goes to the afterlife and the significance of it. This is part of, remember, it's a treatise about justice. And he's going to have to consider what happens after death. So he comes in, he's returned from the dead, and it's a dream sequence. And when Cicero, somewhere about 50 BC, wrote his own Republic, not to be outdone, he added with a similar vision, Scipio Africanus Minor. One of the speakers in Cicero's dialogue relates in the 6th and last book a remarkable dream. Sorry, it's in De Republica. It's not De Officiis. And most of Cicero's Republic has reached us in a fragmentary condition. But it was vastly influential. Cicero is much more influential. For this reason, nobody read Plato's Republic in the medieval period. The only work of Plato that remained was Plato's Timaeus. We're going to get to that as well. So all of the works that you will have read here in undergrad philosophy or will read were unknown through the development of the West. But the Timaeus was, and we'll get to the reasons why that's important in a bit. But the Republic was not known. And yet Cicero's Republic would have been known. And Cicero presenting a response to Plato was important and was influential in the same way that Virgil's Aeneid was influential and important, but again, it leans on other things that weren't necessarily known by others. So the Latin sources are more influential, but they depend on the Greek sources that predated them and may be later on unknown. Most of the works of Plato and Aristotle come back when Christianity confronts Islam in the 12th century. And the works that were preserved in the Greek monasteries come back to Christians and they start reading the classical texts. Part of the beginning of the Renaissance to some degree, interestingly, rather ironically. But anyway, for a reason which will appear later, this part, the Somnium Scipionis, has come down intact. Now, Scipio begins, I'm just going to read this. Scipio begins by telling us that during the evening which preceded his dream, he had been talking about his adoptive grandfather, Scipio Africanus Major. That, he says, is doubtless why he appeared to me in my dream. For our dreams are commonly begotten by our recent waking thoughts. There's a theory of how dreams occur. I was thinking about this and then I dreamt, and there you go. We're going to find different theories of dreams in a bit as well when we come to Macrobius, but we're not there yet. So this little attempt to give plausibility to a fictitious dream by offering psychological causes is imitated in the dream poetry of the Middle Ages. So in Chaucer, in the Parliament of Fowls, he will speak of the dream of Scipio. So influential on works that you read in medieval literature, in English even. And Africanus Major, or Major, carries Africanus Minor up to a height whence he looks down on Carthage from an exalted place, bright and shining, filled with stars. But it's a vision from a mountain looking down. Now, there are corollaries in Scripture as well. Mount Pisgah, where Moses looks into the promised land, the land that he will not enter. But God furnishes him with a vision of where his activities will lead him and his people eventually. He's allowed that vision. Milton's Paradise Lost concludes with the same vision, by the way. They go up in a mountain and they look, the world was set before them. Dickens' Great Expectations concludes with the same thing. And where they'll go. And this is when they're being cast out of paradise. It's presented as being on a mountain, they're looking out. So that same vision is replicated over and over and over and over, and we're supposed to pick up the echoes of it. And with the echoes of the vision or the image, all of the associations go with it, because that's how you read in a literary fashion, with certain images in your mind, the images that have resonances and implications, and sometimes the later author is going to deviate from that and make a different point, but you have to recognize the points being made in conversation with the previous author who he regards as an authority. Very important. He's not just saying, I've read this. He's not showing off. He's saying, this author I regard as authoritative, but I think he got it a little bit wrong. And here's a better way of looking at it. Again, it's the model. It's provisional. It's authoritative, but it can be improved upon. So the idea of progress in the arts does not only begin in the Romantic period. The classical world will be reframed and reinterpreted by Christians, but not only by Christians, but other classicists. As I say, Cicero will read Plato and correct Plato. And that will go on. And that's just why we read ancient authors. Because we recognize that aside from revelation, as in what Scripture gives us, we're speculating. The beauty of Scripture is that Scripture helps us to interpret or to conclude where we're going off the tracks. And so the two will be brought together more and more over the course of time. But anyway, he looks down and he sees from this exalted place, bright and shining, filled with stars, and Lewis comments as they are in fact in the highest celestial sphere, the stellatum, up here, the stellatum, up here in the 8th firmament, the 9th, and the 10th. Actually, it's in the 8th that you see the stars. You see them here? That's the vision. He's looking upwards. And the vision then it's not just looking at the heavens, he's looking at reality. He's looking at where things don't change, where the immortals reside. Actually, where people, among others, Virgil will suggest that Aeneas has gone. He's gone to be a star in the firmament. This is where the Caesars will go, and they'll be worshipped as a star by their ancestors because they're gods on earth, and they will become immortalized after death. And this is a political vision to some degree, and we'll get to that in a very short period here. But this after foretelling his grandson's future political career, Africanus explains to his grandson that all who have been saviors or champions of their native land or increased its dominions have their appointed place in heaven. So that's where you're going to go. You'll be a star. We have that in our day with notions of pop stars, celebrities. Celebrities, by the way, comes from the word kalos, which is heaven, the heavenlies. That's the word celebrity comes from that, right? The beginning of it. The celebrities are the stars, and they're all around us. You're starstruck, walking in your midst. What makes them famous? That you know about them, pretty much. But they haven't done anything, and they can't do anything, and in general, they don't do anything worthy of mention, but you see them. Again, it's the absurdity of our contemporary culture, which becomes evident when you compare it to this. But he says, this is a good instance of the intractable material with which later syncretism was confronted. Cicero is making a heaven for public men, for politicians and generals, as the outcome of the political life. And his comment is that neither the pagan sage like Pythagoras nor the Christian saint could enter it. It's those that serve the Republic, that serve Rome. They will go there, not the saints. They're not going to go there, and neither will the great thinkers. It's the men of deeds. The philosophers don't go here. Just the political life. As I say, Plato disagrees. Socrates thinks that there are two real forms of life. There's the political life, and then there's the theoretical life, that of the philosophers. And he suggests, actually, that the theoretical life is superior. The philosophical life is superior to the political life. Cicero disagrees. As a Roman, unsurprisingly, there aren't many great Roman philosophers. The Greeks are the philosophers. The Romans are interested in the political life. They'll lean on the philosophers, but let's not take them too seriously. Anyway, so there you go. And he then effectively carries on. So I'm going to skip over that. Any comments or questions about that? But the idea of an ascent to heaven as the outcome of the political life is what animates the men of the Roman world. This is why they throw themselves into politics. This is why the Stoic, like Virgil, decides to go into politics even though he has a huge suspicion of friendship and the body, etc., and withdraws from it. And on the other hand is publicly minded. The Stoics always go into politics because they see the outcome of that as some sort of eternal reward. They can ignore the sufferings around them, although to some degree that's what animates them, is they can't ignore a toothache or a civil war, so they seek to prevent that and allow them to contemplate where they will eventually go. Anyway, so let me skip over that, or having said that, I want to move on to another, I think, really important section. This is on page, now let's see if I can get this. Nope, it's too far. That's close. Is this it? I want to deal with nature in section. This is from Lucan. No, it's not. It's Statius, Lady Nature. Have I got that? Right there. So Statius, whose Thebaid appeared in the 90s of the first century, ranked in the Middle Ages alongside Virgil, Homer, and Lucan. Like Lucan, he strained after the stunning phrase less successfully, but also less continuously. He had a larger mind than Lucan, more true seriousness, more pity, a more versatile imagination, etc. And they were regarded as a noble historical event. Now, what he presents here, most importantly for our purposes, is nature appearing for the first time. We get no references, and I have said this in many classes, but I always need to repeat myself on this. The notion of nature that we appeal to about ourselves and the world around us is a new invention. And it's one that only begins in the Roman period amongst the Stoic philosophers. That's where the idea of nature as this all-encompassing divine force begins. It's not in Scripture. You get no reference to nature. Don't read creation as nature. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's not nature. The word nature is not there. Neither is the Hebrew or Greek equivalent, because there's no Hebrew or Greek equivalent to creation there. The word's simply not used. Physis is the wording in Greek, right? And but here we have natura, and he says, Lewis says, and I'm going to read this so I don't miss any of the important context here. The reader of Renaissance and medieval literature will have met this lady, that is natura, or goddess, fairly often. He will recall the veiled and numinous nature of Spenser. Going back from her, he will meet the more genial but hardly less august nature in Chaucer's Parliament of Fowls. In de Guilville's Pèlerinage, he will be surprised by a nature more sturdy and turbulent than either, a nature with more than a dash of the wife of Bath in her, who sets her arms akimbo and stands up to a superior power in defense of her lawful franchises. Now, in C.S. Lewis's the third installment of his space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, the woman is presented in terms of nature as a goddess, love divinized in many ways. And you need to have this in the background of your mind. Lewis is appealing to it there, and if you hadn't read this or didn't have an understanding of Lewis's long understanding of the development of the word nature and its connection with divinity that we worship, you might miss the point there. If you want more on this, I'm not going to read it on the course. Look at Lewis's work, Studies in Words. It's a book. Studies in Words, Nature is the second entry, and it's a 60-page entry that begins with this, and what he presents here in about 3 or 4 pages, he expands onto 60. And he will trace it all the way up to the Romantic period, at which point the study concludes, because we still employ the Romantics' concept of nature as a divine force. And we are part of nature. There's no sense of bearing the imago Dei. There's no sense of a rational being, an individual substance of a rational nature being a person. That's Boethius. That's gone from the Romantics. We're just part of nature. And so, in other words, God is in us, and God is in everything else. In other words, it's pantheism or panentheism. That comes in our period, post-19th century. That stays with us and is connected with nature, and hence the environmental movement wants to prevent any desecrations of nature by human beings and their artifice. It's literally saving the planet. It's a salvific activity. But all the connotations of desecrating a goddess are there. Anyway, he sees, and he will come to the nature who dominates the romance of the rose for thousands of lines, and Chaucer and Spenser. And he will then move on to note that even in Plato's Timaeus, which he's going to make a great deal of very shortly, we will find nothing of nature there either, because Plato had no conception of it. As I said, Plato's Timaeus, which is effectively a creation story, doesn't even mention physis. No mention of it. There are passages in Marcus Aurelius, he says. Marcus Aurelius, the great Roman Stoic, perhaps the last of the Roman Stoics. He addresses physis as a deity. Yes, so that's where it begins. The concept of nature as an all-encompassing goddess is a very late developing thing. The concept, encompassing, and the idea that it's sacred is a Stoic conception, which, ironically, the Romantics are appealing to, but adding further details to it. And we still labor under that misconception that our notion of nature is self-evident, unquestionable. And I think so just the study of the word nature is itself helpful. So, and he says, and this is quite useful, I think, he says, nature may be the oldest of things, but natura is the youngest of deities. Really, ancient mythology knows nothing of her. You will not find it in the Epic of Gilgamesh. You will not find it in scripture. You will not find it in native myths. They don't appeal to nature. Words not there. Concepts not there. It seems to me impossible that such a figure could ever arise in a genuinely mythopoeic age. What we call nature worship was never heard of, has never heard of what we call nature. Mother Nature is a conscious metaphor. Mother Earth is something quite different. All Earth, contrasted with all the sky, can be, indeed must be, intuited as a unity. And the marriage relation between Father Sky and Mother Earth forces itself on the imagination. He's on top, she's beneath. The water rains down, the crops come up. There's a sort of fertility, there's a connection there. But that's Mother Earth, not Mother Nature. Mother Nature includes the sky. It's all encompassing. See the difference? So Mother Earth, yes. And you could say that human beings come from Mother Earth, if you will, although that's not the account in Genesis, and it's not the account in Hesiod either. Although we do have the Olympians who are the sky gods, and then we have the Titans who are actually the earth gods. And guess who wins? The sky gods, and they throw the Titans down into the underworld and punish them. That's a very different thing, though, and none of that is nature in the all-encompassing sense. So again, when we look at this, the classical and medieval image, what it acquaints us with is how imaginative our notion of nature actually is, and how non-scientific and how lacking in factual evidence there is for the earth being a divine thing. It's a hypothesis. Very irrational, and with very little historic precedent for it. And he notes, and I noted this when I studied ancient philosophy in university, that they often begin with the pre-Socratic philosophers, even though they're not really particularly important or interesting. Why did they begin with the pre-Socratic philosophers? When I did ancient philosophy, they spent a whole month on Empedocles and Pythagoras and who else? There's a whole series of them. How come? Well, because they invent nature, is his suggestion. They first had the idea, a much odder one than the veil of immemorial familiarity usually allows us to realize, that the great variety of phenomena which surrounds us could all be impounded under a name and talked about as a single object. Some think that basic element is fire. Some think that it's being, Parmenides. Some think that it's change, Heraclitus, or that the forces are strife and flux, change in other words. The bridge in Toronto, the water I step in now is not the same water I entered in. Water I step out of is not the same that I entered in because of change. So is it being, is it becoming, is it fire, is it water? You'll get different answers to that but they're trying to isolate a single entity that explains all the appearances. And he says later, and because we want to divinize nature in our age, we go look at the pre-Socratics rather than at Plato and Aristotle. But the pre-Socratics aren't particularly significant otherwise. But so later thinkers take over the name and the implication of unity, which, like every name, it carried, but they sometimes used it to cover less than everything. Hence, Aristotle's nature, physis, which covers only the sublunary. For Aristotle, physis is the lunae, the moon, on downwards. This is physis. This is nature. Only up to here. After that is metaphysics. So there's physics and metaphysics, and the metaphysics deals with what's above the moon. What's below the moon is subject to change, mutability, just like the moon. Right? So he does use nature, but he doesn't mean it in an all-encompassing sense. He has metaphysics behind that. Metaphysics is a whole provenance of philosophy that's extraordinarily important for cosmology, about which contemporary philosophers almost never take any interest. But it's key. Cosmology is is huge. And this is what we're dealing with the medieval world picture, is cosmology. A picture here. So he says, in that way, the concept of nature unexpectedly rendered possible a clear conception of the supernatural. So if we have the natural, then the supernatural, what's above and beyond that. Aristotle's God is as supernatural as anything could be. The object, if it is an object called nature, could be personified. And this personification could be either treated as a mere color of rhetoric or seriously accepted as a goddess. That is why the goddess appears so late, long after the real mythopoeic state of mind has passed away, after Homer and others have died centuries before that. You cannot have the goddess nature till you have the concept nature. That's his point. You have to have the concept before you can worship it. And you cannot have the concept until you have begun to abstract. And they abstract from what he calls mythopoeia here. But as long as the concept covers everything, the goddess who personifies the concept is necessarily a jejune and inactive deity, for everything is not a subject about which anything of much interest can be said. Well, tell our contemporaries that. But it's true. If it's everything, okay, well then it's everything. Nothing more can be said if everything's included under nature. And all her religious and all her poetic vitality depends on making her something less than everything. But note, in our day, there's nothing poetic about our conception of nature. It's an abstraction. If she is at times the object of real religious feeling in Marcus Aurelius, that is because he contrasts or confronts her with the finite individual. So here, I'm puny and small in comparison with the greatness of nature, and I feel a sense of awe and the insignificance of my life that leads him to a sort of a humility and a stoic relation to the natural world. He's small even though he's the emperor. That makes him a very good emperor, by the way. He doesn't abuse his power. Restrains his ethically. Anyway, I wanted to deal with that and where it comes from. I think that's important. Let me move on to Apuleius, De Deo Socrates. Now, Apuleius, we're going to confront in a work of Lewis. He will allude to it at any rate later on in the course when he talks about, what's the name of the work? Why have I drawn a blank on that? It's his greatest work of fiction. Sorry? Till We Have Faces, yes. He says that he got it from a section from Apuleius' The Golden Ass. But Apuleius writes the Metamorphosis as well as the Golden Ass. Ovid also writes the Metamorphosis, but never mind. But that's not the most significant work of Apuleius. The most significant one is on the God of Socrates, De Deo Socrates. This is page 40. De Deo Socrates. So on the God of Socrates. Two passages from Plato, he says, underlie this image. One is from the Apology, which students read. And again, we're lost to the Middle Ages, but they came to them through De Deo Socrates of Apuleius. That they would have read, but they didn't read the Apology. What's the section of this? Socrates explains why he abstained from political life. Because politics for the Greeks, just like the Romans, was the way of virtue and the way of immortality. You will become like a god if you do great deeds and speak great words in public. Other people will remember you and immortalize you. That's the way forward. But Socrates says that's not my path. My path is to contemplate the eternal. But he gives an additional reason. And the reason that he abstained from political life is one you have often heard me mention: something divine and daimonic, not demonic, but daimonic. Theon tikai daimonion happens to me. It has been so ever since I was a boy. There comes a voice which, whenever I hear it, always forbids something I am about to do but never commands. So he hears a voice, and the voice tells him, don't do that. And he listens to the voice. So he has a voice in his head that directs him to this. So that's important. And as Lewis notes here, God and daemon, present here in their adjectives divine and daemoniac, may be synonyms, as I take it very often are for other Greek writers, both in prose and verse. But the second passage, which is from the Symposium, which is about love, Plato draws a clear distinction between them, which was to be influential for centuries. So this is the passage I want to draw your attention to. Daemons are creatures of a middle nature between gods and men. Like Milton's middle spirits betwixt the angel or the angelical and humankind. So the angelic beings. And through these intermediaries, angels, and through them alone, we mortals have any intercourse with the gods. We have no intercourse with the gods whatsoever other than through a mediation. The mediation is of the angels. They're the messengers. They go up both ways. God speak through them, and we speak through them as well to the gods. There's a mediator there. It's not a Protestant view. The Protestant view is we speak directly to Christ. Our mediator. He shares our nature. He's the one true mediator between God and man. That's not the medieval view. The medieval view posits a intermediary figures. You could also appeal to the saints who are in between. For theos anthropo ou gignutai, as Apuleius translated, nullus deus miscetur omnibus, no God converses with men. The voice that spoke to Socrates was that of a daemon, not a god, an in-between figure. About these middle spirits, I need to push on. About these middle spirits, or daemons, Apuleius has much to tell us. They naturally inhabit the middle region between earth and ether. They operate here. See between the fire. So there's earth and water here, earth, water, air, and here there's a fire element. And above that, in the realm up above this, is the ether. So the spirits are in the middle region between earth and ether. That is the air. Oh, sorry, it's not in the ether. It's in the air. It's this here. This is where they are, because above the air is the fire. And then above that's the ether. That's where these middle spirits dwell. Scripture seems to give warrant for it. Spirits of the air. It extends upwards as far as the orbit of the moon. All is, in fact, so arranged that every part of nature may have its appropriate animals. By the way, the medievals have no use or have a strong sense of hostility to emptiness, to void, to space. They have a strong aversion to it. They think that everything is populated with something. It's full. There's a plenitude in all things, including what we call outer space. We'll come to that very shortly if I get to heaven, or the heavens. That is not to be seen as outer space. That's our conception. It's not theirs. All is, in fact, so arranged that every part of nature may have its appropriate animals. At first sight, he admits, we might suppose that birds provide the appropriate animals for the air, but they are quite inadequate. They do not ascend above the higher mountaintops. Ratio, that is reason, demands that there should be a species genuinely native to the air, because the birds come down to the ground. They ascend up, but they can only ascend so high. They can't go high enough, and something must be in that realm. As gods are to the ether and men to the earth, and I should be hard put to choose any single English word as the right translation of ratio in this context. Reason, method, fitness, and proportion might all put in a claim. So all of those that's what I mean by ratio here. It's appropriate, it's fit, it's proportionate, it's the method that the universe works here. There's something in that middle space. The daemons have bodies of a finer consistency than clouds, which are not normally visible to us. It is because they have bodies that he calls them animals. Obviously, he does not mean that they are beasts. They are rational, that is, aerial animals, as we are rational terrestrial animals. And the gods proper are rational ethereal animals. Note the threefold rationality. The gods, or God, is in heaven, which is the ether. The angels, or the daemons, are in the air, and we, who have reason, are on earth. So there's a triad here. There's a lot of triads in the Middle Ages. The idea that even the highest created spirits, the gods, as distinct from God, were after their own fashion incarnate and had some sort of material vehicle goes back to Plato. He called the true gods, the deified stars, zoa, animals. Translation. Scholasticism in regarding the angels, which is what the gods or ethereal creatures are called in Christian language. Okay, so I've translated demon to be angel now, as they will. These beings that posit that are the mediators between the being in the ether, God, and the beings on earth, men, are to be regarded as angels. That's where they reside, which is what the gods or ethereal creatures are called in Christian language. Are as pure or naked spirits was revolutionary. The Florentine Platonists reverted to the older view. Now, he will then go on to talk about the different types here. And I don't want to spend too terribly long, but maybe I should just point your attention to this section if you want to see more about this, because he will go on to talk about principles, the principles of the triad, and that maybe this is at the bottom of 43, and I will at least just mention it here. The principle of the triad, the clearest statement of it is Plato himself. From the Timaeus, it is impossible that two things only should be joined together without a triad, without a third rather. There must be some bond in between both to bring them together. Now, they did not see Christ as that mediator in the medieval period. I think it's a mistake. But they saw the angels as the mediator, or the saints as the mediator. You pray to the saint who mediates on your behalf and directs the prayer to God. Even though we have only one mediator between God and man, the God-man, Jesus Christ. That's the mediator. He's both God and man. But that is, I'm not making a theological, I'm commenting, the Middle Ages, that's the importance of the mediators there. So very important, and they get that again from Apuleius and that work, De Deo Socrates. So have a look at that. And you will so the whole of medieval Renaissance literature will appeal to these beings, and they stay in the Western imagination thereafter. Even after the Protestant Reformation, there's still a reference to it. But where do they go? Where are the angels then? It's less obvious where they are or how they function. It sort of requires this cosmology to give them a place at any rate. I mean, the fact you can't see them, maybe they can be anywhere, but that's not their realm. And they don't, even though they're God's messengers, they're not seen as a regular mediator because we appeal directly to God, at least Protestants do, but through Christ, because he happens to be, he's then the mediator. You don't, right? Anyway, the seminal period. Now, the seminal period is, as it suggests, seminal. And I'm going to go through them as quickly as I can. Chalcidius is the first one, page 49. Chalcidius is important for bringing us the Timaeus, among other things. I'll skip all over that. And because he questions whether Chalcidius was a Christian or not, and there's for and against arguments, I'm going to skip all over that. But what Chalcidius does is he translates the Timaeus into Latin. Page 52. And by translating so much of the Timaeus, and thus transmitting it to centuries in which little else of Plato was known, Chalcidius determined what the name of Plato should chiefly stand for throughout the Middle Ages. As I say, they only know the Timaeus from Plato. So Plato is associated as a monotheistic cosmologist, just as Moses is. He's a philosopher of creation. He tells us how it happens. So he's a philosophical version of Moses. The Timaeus had none of the erotic mysticism we find in the Symposium or the Phaedrus, and almost nothing about politics. And though the ideas or forms are mentioned, their real place in Plato's theory of knowledge is not displayed. For Chalcidius, they become ideas almost in the modern sense, thoughts in the mind of God. That's what an idea is. It's a thought in the mind of God, and we think God's thoughts after him, more or less. It is thus came about that for the Middle Ages, Plato was not the logician, nor the philosopher of love, nor the author of the Republic. He was, next to Moses, as I said, the great monotheistic cosmogonist, the philosopher of creation. Hence, paradoxically, the philosopher of that nature which the real Plato so often disparaged. Plato thought this was a ridiculous concept, but through the Timaeus, he becomes the spokesman for it almost. The Timaeus directs us to nature. Plato would have blanched and thrown up. So, and Lewis comments, I think, very, charitably here. To that extent, Chalcidius unconsciously supplied a corrective for the contemptus mundi inherent in Neoplatonism and early Christianity alike. Because suddenly the world is something that God created and is good. And it's probably a necessary step to the scientific revolution. Our goal in life is not to escape the prison house of the body. Our human nature is not a soul, a disembodied entity. We're embodied souls. And so there's a goodness in creation. It's not just a illusion or a prison house for the soul. So that's it. So as his choice of the Timaeus was momentous, so was the fashion in which he treated it. His admitted principle of interpretation was one which makes an author more liable to be misrepresented the more he is revered. In hard places, he holds, we must always attribute to Plato whatever sense appears worthiest the wisdom of so great an authority, which inevitably means that all the dominant ideas of the commentator's own age will be read into him. I love that comment. So Plato means whatever we think is best. And one comment here, and this is interesting, Plato clearly said that the souls of wicked men may be reincarnated as women. And if that doesn't cure them, finally as beasts. Now, what does he mean by this? I can't help but smile here. But he says, we are not, says Chalcidius, and commentators will think there's a derogatory view of women being presented here, and I guess there is. But what is being stated is something slightly different. This is not a literal process of reincarnation. It's more that indulging your passions in this present life, you'll become more and more towards the animal. You'll be more moved by your passions. And Plato and Aristotle and the whole Greek tradition, and the Romans for that matter, regards women as more finely perceptive and moved by their passions. More prone to emotion because they're, he just observes it, and less guided by their reason. And so if you're an irrational, unjust being, you're going to be transformed into something lower. And he's going to connect this also then not to men, women, beasts, that triad, but also reason, thumos, and the passions. So the mind, the chest, and the passions, that triad is there. So the three triads are in view there. So I don't think they literally mean you're going to be reincarnated as a woman. As a punishment. And I guess as a reward for women, if you come back, you're going to be reincarnated as a man, if you're worthy enough. But again, if you take it too literally, you could actually think that that's what's being said. Anyway, I'll skip over that and leave you to that, but there's a great deal of discussion there of Chalcidius, and also this triadic conception, and I only want to leave you with one final discussion of that, and it's the triad I just talked about, because I think it's important. Where is it? There it is. So far, Chalcidius is on common ground with Apuleius. He then proceeds to another application of the triad. The cosmic triad can be envisaged not only as a harmony, but as a polity. A triad of sovereign, executive, and subjects. God, the angels, men. The stellar powers command, the angelic beings execute, and the terrestrials obey. You will find that same triad in politics then. The king, his ministers, and his subjects. And there's a corollary. The triads all map up against each other. The king represents God. King is not God. In the Christian conception, the king is not God. The king is under the law. He may be God's vice regent on earth, but he is not God. There's no sense of the kings being divine in the medieval Christian world. But they are a picture of God in some ways. They represent that, and they understand the importance of the representation. So then, following the Timaeus and the Republic, he finds the same triadic pattern repeated in the ideal state and in the human individual. So now we get the microcosm-macrocosm analogy. In his imagined city, Plato assigned the highest parts to his philosophical rulers, the philosopher kings. And they ruled. They represent the mind, the reason. After them comes the warrior caste, which carries out their orders. They're the executive, or the police. Finally, the common people obey. So in each man, the rational part lives in the body's citadel, that is its capitulum, its head, capitolium. In the camp, or the barracks, the castra of the chest. Warrior-like, the energy which resembles anger, thumos. That which makes a man high-spirited has its station, and appetite, which corresponds to the common people, is located in the abdomen below them both. And Plato, like Lewis observed for us in his Men Without Chest and the Abolition of Man, says that is the picture that governs actually the entire of the Western tradition. That we have to teach that moral, spirited element, which gets angry at injustice, to obey the reason and not the passions. That's an educational process. But that triad, Lewis asserts and assumes is just and commends it to us. But again, he follows the ancient Greeks and the Christians in this. So, and it will be seen how faithfully their triadic conception of the psychological health reflects either the Greek or the later medieval idea of the nurture proper to a free man or a knight. Reason and appetite must not be left facing one another across a no man's land. So don't pit your reason against your appetites. You need a mediator, and the mediator is the thumos, the moral part of a man. A trained sentiment of honor or chivalry must provide the mean that unites them and integrates the civilized man. And that's the job of education then. It's a mean. It's the middle ground between the mind, the rulers, and the passions. You need that. And that's a part of an individual as well. That's what you educate. So that's where he gets this from, if you were wondering. I'm not going to get to heaven today. Macrobius. I will skip over this. But he talks about 5 species of dreams and their various significance. Where is this? Page 63. Five species of dreams. You can look it up for yourselves afterwards. 3 of them have a truthful character and 2 of them don't. But just look at the different types and different ways of seeing dreams. But some of them can be truthful. In our day, we tend to see dreams, if they have any truth, we read them in the way that Carl Jung does. as a sort of archetype, or Sigmund Freud does to some degree, and overstates the significance of dreams. Like every dream has some sort of truth import, and it doesn't. And the medievals were wiser on this. Like some dreams are just, I was thinking about this before I fell asleep. And it doesn't really mean anything. It's just I'm carrying on thinking after I was. But some types of dreams do, and they differentiate different types of dreams. Some being oracles even, which seems to fit more the ancient world's understanding of it, and also scripture for that matter. There's certain dreams that have an oracular quality to them. But anyway, I won't exposit that any further, but there's the passage that I think you should look at. Pseudo-Dionysius, important. I can't skip over Pseudo-Dionysius. Let me go back. There he is. Pseudo-Dionysius is important because at first Dionysius, by the way, was the man who heard Paul address him at the Areopagus in Acts 17. That's who they thought Dionysius, and then later on they said, oh no, that's not the guy. So it's this guy who we call Pseudo-Dionysius then. And initially it was given a greater authority by being an ear witness of Paul's address. That's not who it is. It's probably a Syrian of the 6th century. And his writings are usually regarded as the main channel by which a certain kind of theology entered the Western tradition, negative theology, which presents God as unknowable. Utterly unknowable. So then we can speak of God only in negations. Immortal, invisible, etc. Speak of God by what he's not. Because he's not a being of this world, so we speak of him in purely negative terms. So that's his one important contribution, but the one that Lewis is going to draw our attention to is his angelology. We talked about the angels as mediatory beings just now, but how about the different types of beings? Well, that will come from Pseudo-Dionysius. And he will list a whole series of them and different types and a hierarchy of them. Trinal triplicities, 3 hierarchies, and there are 3 species of angels within each of these hierarchies. So there are 9 orders of the angels. We get this from Pseudo-Dionysius. First hierarchy contains the 3 species: seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. Creatures closest to God, those 3. They face him. Nothing in between. They're the ones that circle God. They're portrayed in cathedrals surrounding God. The names of seraph and throne are both associated by this author with ideas of heat or burning, characteristic well known to the poets. Second hierarchy is the potestates, or the potentates, the powers, the virtues, and the efficacies. Dominations, potentates, and virtues. Second triad. And both of these first 2 hierarchies are directed towards God. They stand, so to speak, with their faces to him and their backs to us. Remember, we're on earth. God's in the heaven, and the angels are in between. These 6 types of angels, the 2 triads, are facing towards God. In the third and lowest hierarchy, we at last find creatures who are concerned with man. It contains princedoms, or principalities, or princes, archangels, and angels. Now note that Milton connects the archangel with seraphim. So he is disputing the angelology, the 9-fold different types there, but never mind. But I mean, just for now, note that this is part of the medieval worldview. Milton is begging to disagree on the ordering here. So he's effectively disagreeing with Pseudo-Dionysius, his authority on this. But the word angel is thus both a generic name for all the 9 species contained in the 3 hierarchies and also a specific name for the very lowest. Just like sailor can include all seafaring persons all the way up to the admiral. It's still a sailor. So an angel encompasses all of them, but it represents the very lowest in the hierarchy of angels. Now, the highest of the lower ones are princedoms, and these are the guardians and patrons of nations. So Michael's the prince of the Jews, based on Daniel 12, verse 1. And Milton says that angels are president in every province. So there is a particular angel associated with a nation, which you will see in the literature of the medieval and Renaissance periods. Provincial guardians. And whereas the archangels and the angels are those that appear to men, like the archangel that arguably appeared to Abraham. Although theologians will say that the three angels were not angels at all. This was a theophany. This is God himself appearing. It's in triune form. I think there's dispute there, but initially in the art, they're rendered as angels, three visitors. So, and the angels who appear to human individuals are the only superhuman beings that do so, for Pseudo-Dionysius is as certain as Plato or Apuleius that God encounters man only through a mean and reads his own philosophy into scripture as freely as Chalcidius had read his into the Timaeus. He cannot deny that theophanies, direct appearances of God himself, appear to patriarchs and prophets, but he's quite sure this never really happens. It appears to be the case that God appears in a theophany to the prophets and the patriarchs, but that's only how it appears. It's impossible. God could not do that, wouldn't do that, because he's there. There's no way of... so he will then posit that it's actually angels. Again, you'll see within the Christian theological tradition debate about who exactly visits the patriarchs and who exactly visits the prophets. Like the cherubim that put the coal on Isaiah's tongue. Finally, Boethius. Say finally because I got about 2 minutes here. Boethius. What can I say about Boethius? Nothing that would not be a travesty to Boethius, because Boethius, he talks about, for how many pages does he go on about for Boethius? He goes on for 16 pages. One of the longest entries. Now, Boethius, I'll just read his intro to it then, because he primarily refers to the consolation of philosophy, which is what undergrads mainly read. I will add a little bit to this, because he doesn't make enough of it, and he should. He does not talk about his treatise on music, which he should, in large part because he ignores the quadrivium. Later on he says, I'm not fit to comment on that, so I'll just leave it aside. I'm not fit to comment on it either, but I do know that Boethius's De Musica is the textbook for Western music all the way to the 19th century. That's not a small thing. It retains that place. It's still being read as a treatise on music. When you think about the music that happens between the 5th century and the 19th century, I think it's rather important. He also writes a treatise on the Trinity, very important, and he's also the one who gives us the sort of orthodox definition of a person, an individual substance of a rational nature. That's from Boethius. But he's not going to talk about that here. He's going to talk about this particular work called De Consolatione Philosophiae. Was for centuries one of the most influential books ever written in Latin. It was translated into Old High German, Italian, Spanish, and Greek, into French by Jean de Meung, into English by no less august figures than Alfred, Chaucer, Queen Elizabeth I, and others. So kings, the most famous kings and queens in England, translated Boethius's Latin text into English. That's how important they regard it. I mean, that's a big thing. When your sovereign wants to read it in the original and gives us a translation, it's paying homage to the importance of the work. And he said until about 200 years ago, it would, I think, have been hard to find an educated man in any European country who did not love it. To acquire a taste for it is almost to become naturalized in the Middle Ages. So then he goes on to talk about Boethius, and I'm not going to do that because I don't have the time to do it, and he speaks of it more extensively, and it actually forbids me to abbreviate it. It misses the whole point of, he's already giving us an abbreviation of it. So by all means read that, and then go on read Boethius with that, but I didn't get you where I said I was going to, namely to heaven, or the heavens. We'll save that for next time. Then we'll deal with the heavens with the longevi, the long-lived. Those beings are also important for Lewis and Tolkien and all the other authors that we associate with the medieval period. And then we'll look at the 7 liberal arts, among other things, and the play out of all this, but that'll be for the final lecture on this, okay?